Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to this third panel that is going to be discussing the repercussions of the framework agreement on the regional crisis. There were concerns, and the concerns for the Gulf countries are now confirmed because these countries have been thinking about the Iranian nightmare since the regime of the Shah, and now we understand that this danger has doubled. And because of this framework agreement, there is anger against the Obama administration because he sold this region for peanuts, as some think, and led these countries to face alone a country that was for years member of the axis of evil. And on the other hand, we know that the regions of this, or the country of this region, have always tried to be committed to their promises. Obama wanted to change history just like Nixon did when he opened up China, except that China and Iran are completely different, and Iran is closer to the model of North Korea. China was a conservative country and closed down country, but it didn't have nuclear activities. This is what Iran has been doing for the last 30 years. Despite the invitation of Obama to meet with the Gulf country leaders to discuss the security in the Gulf region and to reassure them when it comes to this framework agreement with Iran, there are always real concerns in the Gulf region. It shows that what's happening between the Americans and the Iranians is far more than just a nuclear agreement. It's about a comprehensive deal that takes into account the security, political, economic, and also all related interests between the two countries. And it is about the Iranian role in Arab countries, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, and also in Bahrain. The Fertile Crescent is now facing the Shiite Crescent that was mentioned by the Jordanian king 10 years ago. The dilemma is the following: allowing Iran to become a nuclear power 10 years from now, or allowing it to be to have hegemony on the region. Would this lead to a long-term regional conflict that would cause the increase of oil prices and also the dissemination of terrorist groups? There would be also a race on armament in this region that has a list of crises and conflicts. What would the Arabs do after the Camp David meeting? These topics and many other questions we're going to be discussing today with a number of experts. We have Dr. Marwan Kabalan, Dr. Ibrahim Sharqieh, and Dr. Haidar Saeed. We'll give the floor first to Dr. Marwan Kabalan. Dr. Marwan Kabalan is a researcher at the center, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He used to teach at the Kabalan University in Syria. Mr. Marwan, the floor is yours. You are one of us anyway, so. Thank you, Dr. Khaled, for this introduction. It's a very complex issue, the nuclear agreement and the Syrian question, or rather the repercussions of this framework agreement on the Syrian question. I do not have enough time. I believe that it would be hard to tackle all the aspects of this question. I'm one of those who believe that should Iran be seeking a nuclear weapon, this is only a tool and not a purpose per se. Because when you want
not an
to
end.
when you want to achieve or if you want to achieve this nuclear power, it's only a means and not an end, and it wants to increase its hegemony and its presence in the region through this nuclear weapon. So if we were to talk about the nuclear program, I believe that what Iran is trying to do is to use it as a means in order for the West to acknowledge this regime, and I believe that the Iranians managed to do so. Throughout the 35 or 36 years since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Iran has been trying and doing it at its utmost to impose its regime, or at least to get acknowledgement from the West. We know that the US and the West in general tried to undermine the stability of this regime. According to some Iranians as well, they wanted to see this regime leave. Now that Iran, with the Western powers, arrived to this agreement, knowing that there were negotiations with the P+5, so the Iranians were talking to P+5 countries, so the five Security Council members plus. This is major for Iran to negotiate and to talk to six major powers in the world. After that, because of this framework agreement, and after reaching this framework agreement, Iran got acknowledgement when it comes to the legitimacy of this regime. So I believe that the regime is reassured now. It is going to stay, it is going to last, and no one will try to undermine it or sap it following this framework agreement. Unfortunately, six major powers agree and sign this framework agreement. It means that this is like insurance policy for this regime, at least for the upcoming years. So when it comes to this regime staying and the legitimacy of this regime, I believe that this framework agreement has ended this question. It is no longer debatable, and I believe that Iran has won this. It was the first end, or the first purpose when it signed the Lausanne Agreement. We don't know whether it is gonna be a final agreement in June of this year. After this aspect of the regime, the legitimacy of the regime, and acknowledging the regime, I believe that there's another aspect, and that is the regional influence of Iran. I started by saying that the nuclear weapon would only be a means and not an end in order to increase the influence of Iran in the region, and this is what's at stake here. When we talk about influence and hegemony, we're talking specifically about Iraq, Syria, also to some extent in Yemen. I think that the Iranian interest in Yemen is because Iran thinks that Yemen would be a way to put pressure on KSA. It is not a vital or a crucial interest for the Iranians, but unlike Iraq and Syria, that's why we know that the Iranians are much more interested in Iraq and Syria. I believe that the Iranians understood the importance of the Iraq and Syria, and the Iranians wanted to, or actually the Western powers wanted to sign this framework agreement with Iran in order to reassure the Israelis when it comes to this nuclear program of Iran. It would be also a way for the Western powers to open up with Iran to reach interests, such as political interests like the US, for example. I will discuss specifically the Syrian question. To understand the Iranian position when it comes to Syria, we need to understand the priorities of the Iranian regime. What are the matters that are important for the regime, and where Syria comes on this list of priorities? Iran, on the top of its list, is Iran. So the major priority for Iran is Iran. This is how I read this priority list. First of all, Iran, and when I say Iran, I mean the regime itself, the sustainability of this regime, the regime remaining in power. So this is the first priority of the regime, of the Iranian regime, keeping itself, saving itself, and remaining in power. This is what I think would happen undoubtedly when this final agreement is signed. After this first priority comes Iraq, then Syria and Hezbollah, and everything else comes after these three priorities. The question is always asked, why is Syria important for the Iranians? People say that Syria is important for Iran, but why? That's the question. Most of the answers say that that Syria would give Iran a very important foothold on the Mediterranean, and of course Syria would be a way or a bridge between Iran and Hezbollah, and this is true, but Syria is important for the Iranians, and it's not only about Mediterranean, it's actually taking us back towards Iran. This is how I explain things. Syria is important for Iran because without Syria, in my opinion anyway, Iran wouldn't be able to achieve its most important goal, and that is to neutralize Iraq, or to really keep it under its influence and its hegemony. Iran lost more than one historic opportunity to benefit from the change in this region. The first opportunity that it lost was actually after the end of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a chance, there was an opportunity. We all know that the Ottomans and the Iranians were competing on Iraq. And Iran lost this opportunity after the collapse and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It did not achieve its main goal, and that is to control Iraq. I believe that it lost the opportunity again following World War II and when the colonial powers present in the region left. So, you know that after World War I, European powers inherited the influence of the Ottoman Empire. After World War II, these European powers left the region, and Iran should have actually benefited from this opportunity. It did not happen because the US came to replace these European powers. I think that the last opportunity loomed for Iran after the American invasion of Iraq, but it's still trying to use this opportunity in order to achieve its strategic goal. So the only country that Iran had to face throughout the 20th century was Iraq. In my opinion, Iran wants to neutralize Iraq for the longest period possible for it not to become an enemy. We know that the influence of Iran did not really expand, but after the fall of Iraq. So it's a very strategic goal for Iran to control this country. Look at the historic relations between Iraq and Iran. It's a very thorny relation. And regardless of the regime in Iran, the relation between Iraq and Iran didn't differ much, for example, under the Shah and after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Here appears the importance of Syria. Iraq would have been able to defeat Iran during the 8-year war had it not been for the support of Syria. What did not allow this victory was the support of Syria when it comes to Iraq specifically. And Iran understands a great deal that Syria should remain in the Iranian basket, so to speak, and this is the only guarantee to neutralize Iraq and to allow this influence of, or this control of Iran on Iraq. The evidence is that the fall of Mosul came from Syria and not from Iraq, because how did ISIS control Mosul? They came from Syria, then they controlled Mosul, and they expanded in Iraq. For the Iranians, it is vital, in order for them to pursue their control of Iraq, they need the support of Syria. It's more important than the support of Hezbollah, or maybe having a footprint on the Mediterranean. So neutralizing Iraq and keeping it under the control of Iran, they need Syria. The Iranians need Syria to do so.
تبدأ نهاية النفوذ الإيراني في سوريا وليس في العراق لأن
Once again, if Iraq is no longer controlled by Iran, I haven't started yet, and Dr. Khaled is telling me that I still have 5 minutes only. So that's why I think that Iran wants Syria to remain a major ally.
وهذا يعني من وجهة نظري أنه ليس مهما من يحكم سوريا بالنسبة لإيران.
This means that it does not matter to Syria who rules Iran. In fact, there is a lot of talk that Iran is keen on preserving the Bashar al-Assad government in Syria. I think Iran is a state and it deals with matters from the concept of a state dealing, statesmanship, and this is what's most important to keep Syria as a country on its side. This is one thing. The other thing worth mentioning here is Syria is important for the Iranians because it's part and parcel of the regional game. I have said previously that there are three powers competing over the Arab Levant. They are Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And this equation is very complex. If we go back 6 months only, we'll see that each country is an state of animosity with the other two. And the loss of this middle-sized country like Syria, which is placed between these three countries, I think the loss of Syria in favor of any other power is a loss for the states, the other two states. If Syria is if Syria gains the situation in Syria, then the other two will feel the loss, and this is like a zero-sum game for each of the three powers because each of them considers the struggle over Syria as part of the struggle over the Arab Levant. I'll try and summarize in the remainder of the time that to focus on the Syrian question, we are faced with two scenarios. First of all, either the Iranians will feel that it's secure enough to survive, and this may lead it not to worry that much about keeping a country like Syria under its wings. And this is probably one of the results for a possible agreement with the 5+1. And we have to understand what President Obama is saying in this regard when he says any nuclear deal will strengthen the hand of the reformists and make Iran more open. And this is one scenario. The other is for Iran to feel that now it feels secure enough and its regime will survive, and therefore it has nothing to worry about. So therefore, it will try to gain more influence, and this will drive it towards more expansionist policies. And this is probably will be pushing things too far. And this is evident from what the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution said 2 days ago about the Saudi intervention in Yemen. I think in the short term, I probably think that the situation in the area is not stable enough, so we may see a collision yet. The Iranians play well, but in the end do not end up scoring any goals. They maneuver, they play in the midfield well, but their finishing touch is not there. So therefore, they may intervene too much, and their mischievous behavior can be understood as an attempt. Their project is an attempt to not to allow others to achieve their own goals. So the end game here will not be a zero-sum game because although the opportunity was there for them, they could not get Iraq. They lost Iraq because of the strong opposition to them. Now they're losing Syria. And Syria in its entirety was under their influence. Now only parts of it are. And the Iranian influence was a continuous influence from Iran through Iraq to Syria. Now it's more like isolated islands, and in my opinion, we will not see any Iranian flexibility before they realize that the situation in Iraq is in their favor, because Iraq is the jewel in the crown of the Persian Empire, not Syria, and therefore keeping Syria within the sphere of influence for Iran is essential to achieve their bigger strategic aim, goal, and that is keeping Iraq under its influence. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Thank you for respecting the time limit. Although you alluded to many aspects, including the regional challenges, but he said that Syria is the cornerstone between three players: Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, but Iraq remains a jewel in the crown of the Persian Empire. The second paper will be presented by Dr. Ibrahim Sharqieh. He is a fellow at Brookings Institute, and he lectures on international disputes in Georgetown University. And I had the honor of either meeting him on weekly basis, either through lectures or events. So thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. And I hope I will not disappoint you either and stick to the timeline, similarly to what our colleague Dr. Marwan has just done, in order to get into the heart of the matter. I will focus on three parts in my intervention. The first two will represent two rather contradictory treatments of the Iranian behavior in the aftermath of the framework agreement vis-à-vis regional issues, including the Yemen. And despite the contradiction between the two arguments here, I think, in my opinion, each argument carries a large degree of validity and legitimacy. The third part will see a third proposition, which will only increase the complexity of these matters, and that is the possible outcomes of Iranian interventions in the area, including the Yemen. The first argument goes as far as saying that the signing of any nuclear agreement will lead to lessening the Iranian influence in the area, and Iran will not withdraw completely, but will show less interest in regional issues compared to the situation prior to the nuclear agreement. And this is based on four pillars. First of all, the assumption is Iran is a logical, reasonable player, and they decide that they will sort out the situations in Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, etc., Syria, in order to strengthen its negotiating positions at the nuclear table. And because now that this was a need in the past, and now that the nuclear negotiations are reaching their conclusion, so therefore there's no longer a need for Iran to invest anymore in these projects. The second pillar of this argument is when a country signs an international agreement, then by the very nature of these things, the country will be obliged to fulfill its obligations and respect the rules of the game. And this will enhance a methodology that the Americans have used historically, what is known as the containment policy. When you sign agreements and you want to play by the rules and show your respect for the rules of the game, And similarly to what happened with China when China ascended to the World Trade Organization, this, of course, will lead to lessening the tension and the level of Iranian intervention in the area. The third pillar is what Obama has spoken about, and that is the agreement, the signing of any agreement will strengthen the hands of the reformists inside the Iranian regime, and this will lead to Jawad, Zarif, and Rouhani are less likely to, for example, to push things to the brink like what Ahmadinejad used to do, and therefore the whole thing will lead to lessening the tension and the degree of tension in the area. The fourth consideration is now that the Iranian economy has suffered enormously under the sanctions regime, which was unfair and unjust and very severe in the eyes of many in Iran and made the Iranian population suffer. For this reason, Jawad Zarif was received as a national hero upon his return to Tehran, and this reflects the need by the Iranian population to rid themselves of the shackles of the Iranian sanctions regime and focus their attentions internally on that. This is the first argument. The second argument is also valid, but and no less contradictory, which says that whatever the result and the signing of the agreement, the dynamisms of this struggle are not over. Iran is still increasing tension and escalating tension with the Saudi Arabia, and if Iran wants to maintain a strategic balance of power or even manage to win or tilt the balance in its favor, then this means that Iran has invested regionally, like its investment in Syria, 4 years of war in Syria, cannot allow Iran simply to turn its back and turn inwards and go back, pack up its stuff and go home, because the credibility of Iran is on the line now, and people from far and corners of the earth understand that the situation in Yemen, and especially in the last stages of the Houthis managing to gain power in Yemen, only happened by Iranian support. 28 flights a week, the signing of agreements, the building of a power station in Hodeidah, many military advisors. All of this makes it rather difficult, even in the eventuality of signing an agreement, that Iran should turn its back at its allies in the area, because this will, in fact, endanger Iran's credibility and put it on the line, and Iran's reputation will be put on the line, and this will enhance Iran's or increase Iran's intervention in regional issues. The other pillar that I'm basing this argument on is that Iran has done what it has done under very stringent economic sanctions. So what about if Iran manages to free itself from the shackles of these sanctions and have access to other sources and resources? So what can it do in that case? This can only mean that these resources can only be channeled into enhancing Iran's hand power to intervene. And this is based on some indications The minute that we knew about signing an agreement, Iran didn't waste a minute. It started sending an armada to the Gulf of Bab el-Mandeb and other areas, even for a fixed period of 3 months. So the move came immediately after the signing of the agreement, which only reflects Iran's seriousness in probably increasing its intervention. So much so that Darif moved his headquarters, operational headquarters. Of course, he moves between Pakistan, Oman, and he moved his headquarters from Lausanne and and it seems that once that the Iranian the nuclear negotiations front is quietened down a little bit, immediately Iran started utilizing that for its involvement in Yemen. And so this means that when the sanctions are lifted, not only the financial resources, but the political capital at Iran's disposal will be used to deal with the issue of Yemen. And this also indicates another escalation. And the two weakest links in the alliance of 10, that is Pakistan. We see that the Pakistani parliament has already decided to keep a neutral position, although they committed themselves to defending the territories of Saudi Arabia, and also in Erdogan's visit. So a great deal of political shyness in his talk and mention of the Yemeni question. And what we notice at the same time on the reformist camp's attitude, Rouhani has stated that there is a convergence in the Iranian-Turkish positions, and nothing has emerged from the Erdogan-Turkish side to indicate otherwise. The most important and probably the most dangerous aspect of Iran's position that after the announcement of the framework agreement is the fact that the Iranian signing of an agreement will really lead to a closer understanding with Russia. And this is a very sensitive aspect of this. And we will see the Russian position from the beginning of the crisis until now. We see that some fundamental changes in the Russian position, the proposed Security Council resolution before the Security Council led to Russia's rejection of the first draft of the resolution. And this is a tangible change in Russia's position vis-à-vis the Yemeni crisis. This is the most dangerous thing, in my opinion, and that is the change in the Russian position, which will lead to turning Yemen into a new Syria, because the international position will find now many cracks in its wall, and there is a Russian veto ready. And this will take us back to what happened in Syria when Russia paralyzed the international community's ability to move, and then cracks and divisions started appearing, etc., etc. This is the other argument. In my estimation, and despite the contradictions, I'll be brief now, that in my estimation, and this is what I see now, that we should not exaggerate and blow out of proportion the impact of any nuclear deal on Iran's ability or willingness to interfere in the area. We should not think that this deal will lead to a fundamental change in Iran's core positions. Ultimately, the international a country's international policies are determined by certain factors, and with or without a nuclear agreement, Iran will carry on regardless. And wars by proxy are very almost impossible for the leading party taking over from the proxy. Iran is not going to engage in a direct military action in Yemen against Saudi Arabia for the sake of Al Houthi or others. They will provide him with military, economic, and political help, even in the Cuban Missile Crisis when John Kennedy decided that the opportunity was there and the time was right to interfere. The Soviet Union, although it was at the peak of its power, had to give in that case and yield into the position. So, with or without a nuclear deal, Iran will find itself, even if it liberates all its financial resources and others, there will be some constants that they cannot ignore. Iran, instead of, for example, occupying the fifth position, will move into the fourth position or something in when it comes to these issues, like Yemen, for example. But the Yemen will move from the fifth position to the fourth, maybe, but not to the top of the agenda, because it's not just the nuclear agreement really which will determine the outcome. Uh, Everything will depend on the strength of the alliance the Saudis have built. If this alliance maintains its strength, and even if the Iranians allowed percentage of 3 point something enrichment of uranium to be increased to 25%, this will not change anything. What will determine the Iranian intervention and behavior is to cohesion and the strength and the ability to maintain this alliance that the Saudis have formed and are leading. The third pillar here is to set a ceiling for the military campaign in Yemen will in fact determine to a large extent the Iranian behavior post-nuclear deal, that is. So if the aim is to end up in weakening the Houthis, containing them, or forcing them into negotiations, or bringing them back to the political process, then there will be no Iranian intervention. However, if the ceiling is higher than that and it's aimed at the de-Baathification or de-Houthization or whatever you call it in English, then we can expect then a different Iranian position, which may not necessarily be manifested in an airdrop on the ground, but some sort of an intervention. Finally, there will be a very important psychological factor on the Gulf countries as a result of signing this agreement. I don't think there is any need for exaggerating that and what can Iran do after the agreement, and now that Iran has signed this deal, will start acting as the policeman of the area, etc., etc. I think the situation will not be like that. I think we really need to keep away from the emotional side and look for more concrete means of analyzing the situation and wars of proxy. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. You spoke on my behalf, actually, and what I had in mind. Dr. Ibrahim mentioned a number of scenarios, one that was pessimistic, one that was rather optimistic. He spoke of factors that would probably lead to less tensions in the region, according to one argument. But what would happen now after the signing off of this framework agreement? And he said that the coalition that was launched by KSA would actually determine the behavior of Iran in the region for the upcoming years. The third panelist, Dr. Haidar Saeed. Dr. Haidar Saeed is an Iraqi researcher. He works as a researcher in Amman and Jordan. He holds a PhD in linguistics. Doctor, you have 15 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for the invite. I think that we were invited to participate in a rather brainstorming panel. It is not really a conference. I think that it is an exercise of brainstorming. It is very interesting to hold this conference after the signing of the so-called framework agreement between Iran and the P+5. In this exercise of brainstorming and in the time that I have, I will try to shed light on a number of points. First of all, I think that the nuclear agreement signed with Iran made us as Arab elite and as Arab intellectuals go back to tackle a historic question that was always controversial, and that is the relation between Iran and the Arabs. And I believe that the debate on this matter is still ongoing. It never stopped anyway throughout decades and centuries. But now something has changed in this relation, and this change explains probably, or is explained by the change of the relation between Iran and the West. I think that the events that we see in the region, at least since the Arab Spring, are not very clear when it comes to the role of all political stakeholders. And because these events are not very clear, the framework agreement led to a number of, I'm a linguist, so we understand relatively. We do not understand, or we do not explain absolutely. We cannot assert we are not 100% sure. This means that some understood this framework agreement as not allowing Iran to be a dissuasion power. Some understood the framework agreement as actually being an attempt from the US to redraw the map of its allies in the region, so from the Arabs moving to having Iran as a major ally. And obviously, all these explanations would or may lead to a policy. In the time that is given to me, I will try to shed light on arguments that what I think is a rational approach that would allow also, that would lead to a rational policy when it comes to Iran and to the framework agreement. I believe that we are among Arabs really in this conference, and I will be very frank. I want to say that many Arab parties did not want to see Iran and the P+5 reach this agreement. And this was very clear in light of many positions that were taken prior to this agreement. It seems that Arabs thought that having Iran remaining under the sanctions would limit its nuclear ambitions. That's why there was a resistance or maybe a rejection from the Arabs when it comes to this agreement. Personally, I believe that the framework agreement actually was achieved in 2013 and not in April 2015. What happened in summer 2013, June 2013 specifically, was the election of Hassan Rouhani, president of Iran. Those who understand the details of the political regime in Iran, and it's very hard, of course, to understand this regime. And, some speak of a religious democracy now in the literature, but nobody deals with this regime as being a democratic regime. Hence, having Hassan Rouhani winning the elections in Iran did not echo the will of the Iranian power. It was rather a choice by the higher leadership in Iran for Hassan Rouhani as a person, as a figure, and I mean by that the Iranian Murshid Supreme Court. Who is Rouhani and why Rouhani? Rouhani was part of the of President Rafsanjani team. Rafsanjani actually had led the pragmatic policy of Iran following 89 and the death of Khomeini. And I always remind my audience of a point in the will of Khomeini, who said, do not deal with three: Al Saud, Saddam, and the greatest evil. Rafsanjani, who came to power after 89, dealt with all of them. In the 90s with Iraq, also with KSA, and he had links with the US. Rouhani comes from this team, that of Rafsanjani, or the camp of Rafsanjani. However, when Rouhani won the elections, he was presented as being really part of the line of the reformists in Iran, i.e. The former president who was in power until 2005. Khatami wrote a very important article following the winning of Rouhani. You know very well that Rouhani believes in a constructive rapprochement. So this constructive rapprochement policy is actually coming to follow or to continue the policy of rapprochement between civilizations, and that was launched by the president in 2002. In other words, in my opinion, they deliberately wanted to present Rouhani as being a reformist, and that this is really the end of the radicalist policy under Ahmadinejad. I think that there was a very important point that was mentioned today, and it was rather controversial, and I'd like to tackle it as well. I think that, yes, it's not an illusion to have really a dual approach in Iran, but because it's a very complex political regime in Iran, some institutions in Iran seem to be deaf. You cannot penetrate it. When we talk, for example, about the Revolutionary Guard institution, or for example, the Iranian intelligence or secret services, you don't really have the dynamics of a reformist against a conservative duality. The dynamics are different in these institutions, regardless of the political debate that you see on the level of the presidency in Iran, for example. So, the choice of Rouhani, I tried to explain earlier, so how Rouhani was presented. The choice of Rouhani means that Iran is accepting the policy of sanctions imposed by the West. And Iran, after Rouhani, because I think that in December 2013 the Geneva Agreement was signed. So Iran accepted concessions, major concessions when it comes to the nuclear power program. Recently, Western think tanks and research centers looked closely into the sanctions program imposed on Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, even on Cuba. And these researchers and some politicians even in the West tend to say that the sanctions in Iran are the first success story in terms of sanctions. At least these were the most successful sanctions imposed compared, for example, to the sanctions imposed on Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. Those sanctions were useless and they were not at all successful. However, the sanctions on Iran were very successful. Why? Because they allowed a new path in politics. And this is the most important issue here that Arabs should understand. The West cannot turn a blind eye or maybe disregard a success story in terms of sanctions and deal with Iran again as being an enemy. This is, in my opinion, what led President Obama to really launch and announce what is called. I haven't started to really tackle the details, but as I said, it's an exercise of brainstorming. And the three of us had to, the panelists, I mean, had to talk in general terms before we get to the core of the paper. But still, I really had to explain all this. President Obama launched a new diplomacy when it comes to Iran. The substance of this diplomacy is to make Iran a positive stakeholder in the region, a positive player. Since 2001, the region witnessed a number of major transformations and changes. I believe that one of these changes and transformations that wasn't really tackled from the academic perspective is the change that we saw between spring 2013, or summer 2013 and spring 2014. What happened during this period? First of all, what we can probably name the change in the Shiite policies, and second, ISIS. April 2013, in June 2013, Khatami is elected. Mosul falls. And when we talk about the fall of Mosul, this is very symbolic when it comes to the expansion of Daesh or ISIS, and then the election of, or the appointment of Haidar Al Jaber, Prime Minister of Iraq. Let me talk here about Iraq. So this change in the policy of the Shiites and the rise of ISIS has actually led to a different map in the region. We were very close maybe to an understanding between Arabs and the Iranians. It makes me think of the atmosphere following the arrival of President Rouhani and the arrival of Al Abadi. It seemed like the Arab countries would be able to come closer to Iran and to accept an Iraq that was ruled by the Shiites. And even the ascension or the rise of ISIS has led to an approach among Arabs that is completely different when it comes to Iraq. Now Arabs understand that it's important to support the state in Iraq and not a specific political stakeholder in Iraq. Now it is understood among Arabs that any failed state in Iraq would not be limited to the boundaries of Iraq and would spill, of course, over these borders. When we listen, for example, to the leaders, to the Gulf leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh recently, they were very clear. It's important to support the state in Iraq. So this is what I called a crucial change there. Maybe we still felt back then that we had contradictory policies in the region. On the one hand, we were very optimistic after the arrival of President Rouhani in Iran, but there was one explanation when it comes, for example, to the oil prices, part of this was to undermine Iran and Russia. We had positions, yes, in terms of supporting the state in Iraq, but also there were statements that expressed concern when it comes to the Iranian role in Iraq. Politically, I will highlight what I said, saying the following. Yes, we were talking about a new period, but there were still concerns remaining from the past. Iran also witnessed this duality. As I said, there's a new diplomacy when it comes to Iran, making Iran a positive stakeholder in the region. Iran wanted to really distinguish this diplomacy, this new diplomacy, from its ambitions. We always talk about the ambitions of Iran and the empire of Iran. I think that it has to do with the geopolitical situation of Iran. Always we have seen in Iran the idea of expansion beyond its borders, and that's why Iran used the Islam and the Shiite creed in order to go beyond its borders, and then under the Shah, and later on exporting the Islamic Revolution. I will give you a very short example from Yemen, and then I will go back to Tikrit, and I'll be very brief. It is clear for when it comes to Yemen, the example of Yemen, that the West doesn't perceive Iran as a permanent ally. The approach, the understanding of the role of Iran in Yemen differs from that in Iraq. We saw what happened in Yemen, we saw what happened in Tikrit. I think there is an implicit acceptance of Iran participating in the Tikrit battle. When it comes to the Tikrit battle, let me say the following. The Tikrit battle was not an American decision. The Tikrit battle was an Iranian decision, because the US didn't want this battle in Tikrit. Tikrit wasn't considered as a strategic goal. Tikrit, yes, is close to the borders with the Shiite regions and to the center, i.e. Baghdad. It would have been possible to start the battle against ISIS in Nainawa or in Anbar. However, Iran believed that it was important to win symbolically in an easy region such as Tikrit. And the Iranian advisors played a very important role when it came to the Tikrit battle. Now, my major concern, and I'll keep it to that, and this is something I want from the friends and all those who speak the Farsi language. I want to understand the official understanding in Iran of ISIS. Does Iran think, like the US think, that ISIS or Daesh is really the product of the political problems in Iraq, or of the problems of the Sunnis? Because Iran fought the Battle of Tikrit with Shiite soldiers, knowing that fighting ISIS, according to the Americans, and this is what we say as well, those should be from the local community. And with the fight against ISIS, there should be also reformist decisions in Baghdad. However, I talked about this new diplomacy. American institutions, whether political or in the military, don't agree when it comes to Iran. John Kerry was very clear. He said, we accept Iran if it were to play a very positive role in the fight against ISIS. But the military, the army, fears this Iranian role. This was said by General Dempsey, who said the participation of Iran in the Tikrit battle would increase the influence of Iran in Iraq, and also would cause sectarian tensions. Now, how did the battle of Tikrit end? And I want to conclude with this. The code that was used in the American-Iranian dialogue on Tikrit, the same code applied to the framework agreement. When it was clear to the Americans that if this victory is done by Iranian hands in Tikrit, this would complicate the situation in Iraq. And that's why this is probably this doesn't appear. You need inside information. The Americans only accepted to start bombing Tikrit if or when the Iranian advisors and the Hashd Sha'bi or the forces of popular mobilization leave Tikrit. I want to talk now about the post ISIS period. I think that, and these are general terms, I don't have time to dwell on it. There was the need, and the Iranians wanted a unified Shiite body in Iraq. Now, after ISIS, this was no longer a priority for Iran. The priority now is to support the Shiites, and specifically those who believe in the transnational axis or policy led by Iran. I believe that al-Maliki embodies and represents this currently.
Thank you, Dr. Haidar. You alluded to important issues, and maybe the agreement will draw the map of the American alliances in the area. Maybe in addition to the Arab allies, we'll see an Iranian allies now. Please, we want to have the time for questions now. It's Haim Al-Thani. I just wanted to pose a question about my question is about the Arab weapon that Iran is using, and that is the Arab militias allied to Iran, because Iran's influence now has moved into the fabric of Arab societies. And I have two questions here. Why do these people have their alliances and allegiances to Iran, and why? I think this is even bigger than the nuclear issue, because even if Iran loses its nuclear option, these militias will remain. And also, Al-Qaeda was established to fight Russia, but after that it was used to fight regimes and America. So if an agreement is reached with Iran, will these militias be turned into performing other tasks? Thank you. Fadl Abdul Ghani from the Syrian Network for Human Rights. My question to Dr. Marwan: how do you see the future prospects of this Arab awakening, if we can call it that, with a decisive storm? And will the Arabs turn their attentions to Syria afterwards? I mean, in view of the fact that the Iranian support to Syria, which amounts to $65 billion in value. This is on top of diplomatic, political, military help, and actual militias fighting on the ground. And also China, for example, is taking this strong position against the Syrian revolution because of the influence of the Iranian diplomacy. And you know what happens at the Security Council, the relative UN Security Council resolution, which never mention the Shiite militias. It only talks about Sunni terrorism. Thank you. And it's evidently clear now from what's been going on in the last 2 days and the corridors of the Security Council, that Russia is playing the same role vis-à-vis the Yemen similarly to what it has done in Syria. So the permanent Russian representative is not only diluting the proposed Arab draft resolution. Yesterday, he called for an unofficial session to deliberate the issue, and it's obvious that Saudi Arabia now is a member of the Security Council, a non-permanent member. And my question is, don't you see that the time has come now that and to support our representatives at the UN with some summit diplomacy, and shouldn't we have immediate contact with the Russian president from the leaders of the Decisive Storm military campaign to neutralize the Russian role at the level of the Security Council? And Russia should realize whose interests matter more, its interests with Iran or the Arabs. Thank you. Please be brief. My question to Dr. Haidar, I may have misunderstood him, but I just want to understand better in the context of his in his presentation that the presence of ISIL was a necessity to change many equations. So is this correct, my understanding? Tariq Zumar from the Development Party in Egypt. I think the Arab security, as pan-Arab national security, is present as an issue in the Iran negotiations with the 5+1. Why shouldn't we make it a priority for us to possess an Arab nuclear weapon? And by that I mean to reconciliate our positions as governments and Arab people, gain our own people to our own side, and by that we will have a nuclear power as equal to nuclear power in its effect and impact. My name is Mohammed Shams. My question is to Dr. Marwan. If the strategic goal of Iran in Syria is to contain or neutralize Iraq, don't you agree that Iraq is already neutralized? And if the situation in Syria is sorted out, what impact will that on Iraq? I think that's enough, and we give 5 minutes to each of our panelists. Questions are varied on the decisive storm, militias, Arab nuclear bomb, etc. We start with Dr. Haidar. Thank you, Chair. I have 2 questions, I think, on militias and ISIL. I think this concern me. Sheikh Suhaim Al-Thani, I think the question of militias is a very complex one. We cannot simply say they are Iranian militias or Iranian-backed, and this will not solve the problem. These are Iraqi militias. I mean, let's be clear about that. Some of them historically were established in Iran in the early 80s. Some of them were established inside Iraq after 2003. And some were hastily organized after the fall of Mosul. Now there are some 50 different militias. Now what we are saying is providing a formal cover for the militias. And I had a paper some 6 months ago, but many things happened since then. Before that, perhaps I ought to say that these militias have so many contradictions between them that we can never treat them as one bloc. To start with determining the mission of this popular mobilization, like the ones belonging to Muqtada al-Sadr, and these are called the Peace Brigades. They think their mission is to protect the Shiite holy shrines. Others think their job or mission is to liberate Iraq from ISIL. And we now know that the maestro behind all these militias and their movements is Iran. And unifying their role and mission is done by Iran. It really how the leaders of this popular mobilization mission changed in the minds of its leaders. Some people inside the Iraqi government now are thinking of creating a new dynamism whereby attaching these militias to the Iraqi state and sponsoring them by the Iraqi states from the Iraqi treasury's money will eventually lead to their independence. I think eventually they'll be turned into a third power between the army and the force, because you remember the Iraqi military has failed completely and collapsed, and nobody can dare disband these militias because after the demise of the Iraqi army, nobody stood up to ISIL in the opinions of many, apart from these Shiite militias. So therefore, ISIL, I, I do not accept the conspiracy theory that ISIL is the result of an outside conspiracy. I do not agree with that. I think ISIL is the result of the crisis of the Iraqi system, the Iraqi government, and how in the spring of 2010 ISIL was as good as dead, and only 4 years later managed to gain control over Iraq's second largest city. But what matters to me is how Iran looks at ISIL. Does Iran consider this as a result of the failure of the Iraqi state, which is influenced by Iran, or is it part and parcel of the Sunni camp against Iran? Because how Iran understands ISIL is important to understand the situation in Iraq. What do we do now? Thank you, Dr. Khaled. I will take two questions. I'll start with Sheikh Suhaim's question, because I think this was one of the most beautiful questions I heard this today. Despite the fact that we may disagree on to what extent the Iranian influence has made its way and penetrated into the national social fabric of Arab countries, I may disagree with that, but I think the minorities in the Arab world siding with Iran is the result of the lack of the concept of citizenship in Arab countries and some sort of the oppression or grievances, maybe not oppression, felt by these minorities, and therefore they start looking towards outside alliances. As for the grievances felt by a number of minorities, say for example in Yemen, the Houthis, before approaching Iran, and frankly speaking, were subjected to a large degree of oppression in Yemen. So maybe, therefore, there may be some Houthi aspirations towards allying themselves with Iran. And similarly, the Shiites in Lebanon and how it was in the 70s and 80s and their situation in Lebanon. This is very important for Arab countries. If we enhance the concept of citizenship and alleviate the suffering of the minorities and respond positively to their grievances, you will not need to fear the influence of Iran, Pakistan, or Turkey, because this convergence is based on mutual interest. And now I'm quoting my friend Rami Khouri, who used to say that if you look at Arab citizens, have you ever heard any Arab citizen wishing to go and live in Tehran? Nobody wants that. They want to go and live in Dubai instead. So this means that this is based on their interest only, and this is something Iran has utilized, and even the sectarian background of the Houthis and Zaydis. I think basically this all emanates from feeling of despair and grievances, and, which are utilized and used and misused until eventually it reaches the stages we are seeing now. And in the beginning of the 80s, maybe it was different. At the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there was some attraction felt by people, Arab masses, towards the Iranian model, but this is no longer the case now. The early 80s, you will see pictures of Khomeini in Amman, Damascus, and North Africa. Where do you find the pictures of Khomeini now? Maybe in parts of Beirut and parts of Yemen. So therefore, this is an important question, and it requires the Arab countries to understand this question and deal with it positively through enhancing the concept of the rights of its own citizens. And the other question on Russia, on Yemen, the Arabs made this mistake when they ignored the Russian connection in Syria, and they're doing the same in Yemen. Whether we like it or not, Russia is a major power. It has the right of veto. It can paralyze everything when it comes to international community's attempts to deal with any crisis. This was ignored for a long time, and after huge effort and writings by analysts, the Russians came up with an initiative, and but it was not met positively. So therefore, Russia was kept away, and the Syrian example informs us a lot about what's happening. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Marwan, we will end the session with you. What are our choices? Do we have plan B? Can we build our own Arab nuclear bomb? Thank you. And before I try to even attempt to answer your difficult question, I will try to respond to Mr. Mohammed's question on Syria and Iraq. I think Iran, like any other country in the world, is captive to its geographical location, and the Iranian sphere of influence can only go towards west, towards Iraq, because they cannot move northwards, because there they'll find Russia. If they move eastwards, there is Central Asian desert. So therefore, Iran always tried to move westwardly towards Iraq. And we see traditionally the struggle in the east was between the Safavids and the Ottomans over Iraq, and every time there was the demise of the Iraqi state or the state Iraq was part of, Iran tried to expand its control over Iraq. In the days of Saddam Hussein, Iraq has become a formidable military power, and I think Iran's fear has always been from an independent, strong Iraqi state which enjoys support by Arab masses. So if the 8 years of war with Iraq's military power and the support by the Arabs really must have constituted a strategic threat to Iran. When the Americans came 2003 and destroyed the balance of power and removed Iraq from the equation, then Iran's strategic objective now is to avoid at any cost the return of a strong, unified Iraq. And in order to uh, bring into a halt any effort by Iraq to become a united and strong country again, without that, Iran, of course, cannot achieve that without the alliance with Syria. And by the way, Hafez al-Assad's relationships with the Shah of Iran preceded the Iranian revolution. And it had a lot to do with the Algiers agreement with Saddam Hussein, which ended up in sharing control over the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Of course, Syria's role was central in the 80-year-old Iran-Iraq war, and without Syria's support, Iraq could have gained much bigger results. In 1982, Syria stopped Iraq's main the exporting route for the oil, and of course Syria was a close ally and the principal ally of Iran, and Iran realizes that and wants Syria's help to keep Iraq as a weak country. And Iran has realized the importance of Mosul, of Syria, sorry, after the fall of Mosul. And in Iranian understanding, ISIL came from Syria to take control of Mosul. So therefore, they must keep Iraq as a satellite, keep Iraq as a satellite country to Iran at any cost. I agree. I too want an Arab nuclear bomb, but my fear is it may be used against Arab people. We know, we know all the weapons that our countries spent our money on, they ended up using against us. So if they want a bomb but do not use it against us, fine. Thank you very much. We really hope to have more options, but it seems that the Arabs have very limited options. Thank you. We come to the end of this session. I thank Dr. Ibrahim Sharqieh, Dr. Haidar Saeed, Dr. Marwan Kabalan, and 5 minutes from now we will have the final session of the day. Thank you.